The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I opened it. I knew what it was the moment I saw the gold-embossed return address. Vivienne Calloway, written in that dramatic cursive she'd practiced since she was 14 years old, back when she decided that everything about her life needed to look expensive. I recognized the stationery too. Thick cream cardstock with a subtle shimmer to it, the kind you ordered from boutique print shops in the city. The kind that cost more per sheet than my lunch. My name was on the front, Dr. Nadine Osei. She'd used my full title, which surprised me, because Vivienne hadn't called me a doctor in the 3 years since I'd earned that title. To her, I was still just her stepsister who smelled like hospital corridors and worked too many overnight shifts to have a real social life. I made a cup of tea before I finally opened it. The invitation was beautiful, I'll give her that. Soft gold lettering on ivory card. Vivienne and Calloway and Theodore Ashworth Reeves. A destination wedding at a vineyard estate in Sonoma, California. Black tie. Evening ceremony. A weekend affair with accommodation provided for close family and select guests. I was in the select guests column, not the close family one. I noticed that immediately. There was a handwritten note tucked behind the main card, in Vivienne's looping handwriting. It said, "Nadine, I know things have been weird between us. I'd love for you to come. Theo's family is very important, and it would mean a lot to have you there. You're still family no matter what." Then, almost like an afterthought in smaller letters at the bottom. "Also, you're the only medical person I trust. Just in case." I read that line 4 times. Just in case. That was Vivienne's way of telling me she wanted a personal on-call nurse at her wedding, dressed in a gown, blending into the background, ready to spring into action if someone's blood pressure spiked or a groomsman drank himself into a medical situation. She wasn't inviting me as her sister. She was inviting me as her safety net. I should have put the invitation back in the envelope and gone to sleep. Instead, I found myself thinking about my stepmother, Gloria, who had raised both of us under the same roof for 11 years. Gloria, who was battling early-stage rheumatoid arthritis, and who I knew would be at this wedding, navigating cobblestone vineyard paths on joints that already ached every morning. Gloria, who had never once made me feel like the outsider, even when her biological daughter made it her mission to remind me that I was. I RSVP'd yes before I finished my tea. And somewhere between clicking attending on the wedding website and setting my phone back down on the counter, I had the quietest feeling, the kind you can't explain but can't shake, that this wedding was going to change something. I just didn't know what. I didn't know yet that the answer would come from a man I'd never expected to see again. People always assumed Vivienne and I had the classic wicked stepsister dynamic. One of us cruel, one of us victimized, a clear villain and a clear hero. The truth was messier than that, the way most real things are. My father married Gloria when I was 9 years old. Vivienne was 8. Our mothers were both gone, mine to cancer, hers to a car accident. And for a brief, fragile window of time, Vivienne and I clung to each other the way children do when the world has been unreasonably unkind. We shared a bedroom for 2 years. We built blanket forts. We stayed up whispering about our mothers, comparing memories like trading cards, trying to keep the images vivid and alive. Then Vivienne discovered that she was beautiful, and the world began to tell her so constantly, and something shifted. It wasn't cruelty exactly, not at first. It was just that Vivienne began to understand her currency. She learned that her blonde hair and her easy smile and her talent for reading a room opened doors for her. And somewhere along the way, she started measuring the people around her by what doors they could open for her in return. I was quiet. I was studious. I spent weekends in the library while she spent them at birthday parties for girls whose parents had vacation homes. I was not useful to her image, so I became invisible to it. By the time we were teenagers, we were politely distant. By the time I got into medical school, we were strangers who shared a last name. The thing I never told anyone, not my closest colleagues, not my therapist, not even Gloria, was that I never stopped wanting it to be different. There was still a 9-year-old inside me who remembered the blanket forts, who had believed for those 2 years that we were something real to each other. That 9-year-old was the one who clicked attending. The grown woman who flew to Sonoma 3 weeks later had a plan to be gracious, distant, and completely unbothered. She packed a sleek black evening gown, a pair of heels she could actually walk in, and a professional smile she'd perfected over years of delivering difficult news to frightened families. What she did not pack was any expectation of being seen. That was her first mistake. The estate was breathtaking in the way that places look when serious money has been spent to make them appear effortless. Rolling hills, manicured vines heavy with late-season fruit. A main house that sprawled across the hillside like something from an architectural magazine. The Ashworth-Reeves family had rented the entire property for the weekend. 70 guests, all housed in various cottages and suites that dotted the estate. When I checked in at the welcome table, a perky coordinator with a headset and a clipboard scanned my name and smiled brightly. "Dr. Osei, Vivienne mentioned you. She said you're a nurse." I paused for just a moment before I smiled back. "Physician," I said pleasantly. "Emergency medicine." "Oh, wonderful." She made a small note. "We'll add you to the emergency contact sheet for the weekend." I picked up my welcome bag and my room key and told myself it didn't matter. It mattered. But what I didn't know yet was that across the estate, in the main house's great room, a man was looking at the weekend guest list. And he had just stopped on my name. And the expression on his face was one I would only find out about later. Not surprise exactly, but the slow, careful recognition of someone connecting dots they hadn't expected to ever see connected. The rehearsal dinner was held under strings of warm lights on the main terrace. Long tables dressed in ivory linen, candles flickering in the September evening breeze. It was the kind of setting that made people feel, temporarily, that life was nothing but beautiful moments strung together effortlessly. I found my seat, near the end of one of the outer tables, between a cousin of the groom's I'd never met and an empty chair, and settled in with a glass of sparkling water and the private intention of getting through the evening with minimum interaction. Vivienne arrived like she always arrived, as if the gathering had been waiting for her. She wore a champagne-colored silk slip dress, her hair loose and golden, Theo at her side looking the way men look when they can't quite believe their luck. He was handsome in a soft, open way. He laughed easily. He touched the small of her back like he was afraid she might float away. I found myself hoping, genuinely, that he was a good man. For Gloria's sake. For the ghost of those blanket forts. Vivienne moved through the tables greeting guests with practiced warmth, and when she reached mine she leaned down and pressed her cheek briefly to mine in that air-kiss way she had. "Nadine, you look great. That's such a practical dress." She said it like a compliment. It wasn't. "Have you met everyone?" Before I could answer, she had already moved on. The empty chair beside me was filled an hour into dinner by a woman named Rosaria, Theo's aunt from his mother's side, a warm and relentlessly curious Italian-American woman in her 60s who had apparently been seated at the wrong table and didn't care at all. She refilled my wine glass without asking and said, with the confidence of someone who never softened her observations, "That one," she nodded toward Vivienne. "She's marrying up and she knows it. The question is whether Theodore knows it." "She's my stepsister," I said. Rosaria looked at me for a long moment. "And you're the one they put at the outside table." I didn't answer, but she laughed anyway, a short, warm sound, and patted my hand. "Don't worry, Tesoro. Dining room geography never reflects actual importance. I've seen very powerful people seated near the kitchen." Then she turned slightly and said, "You should meet Theo's father before tomorrow. He's an interesting man. He spent years working in medical development. He has a great respect for doctors." She paused, and something in her pause was pointed without being obvious. "I think you two might know some of the same people." I thought nothing of it at the time. I was too distracted by what happened 20 minutes later. Vivienne had moved to the center of the terrace for the toasts, and she pulled me into the spotlight with the specific kind of surprise maneuver she'd perfected over a lifetime of making things look spontaneous. "And I have to mention my stepsister Nadine," she said into the small microphone, her voice carrying easily across the terrace. Flew actually all the way here. She's a nurse, she works so hard, and I know this weekend is a big deal for her." She smiled at me with that radiant, untouchable smile. "We're so glad you could make it." There was a gentle wave of applause. "Nurse. Not doctor. Not Dr. Osei. Not physician. Nurse." I smiled with everything I had. The smile I used when I had to tell someone their scan results were worse than expected. The smile that didn't crack. But across the terrace, someone heard it. And what I wouldn't learn until the next morning was that the person who heard it was already watching me, had been watching me since I arrived, and what Vivienne said in that moment triggered a decision he had been quietly considering all evening. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 100 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now let's continue. I woke early on the wedding day, before the estate came alive with the bustle of hair stylists and florists and event coordinators speaking urgently into their headsets. I pulled on running shoes and a light jacket and walked the outer edge of the property in the cool morning quiet, the way I always did before long hospital shifts. Clearing my mind, finding my center, preparing to be steady for whatever the day brought. The vines were extraordinary in the early light. Heavy and orderly and ancient, stretching in long green rows down the hillside, mist still clinging to the lower sections. I walked slowly, letting myself be present in the beauty of the place without the social armor I'd need later. I almost didn't notice the man sitting on the stone bench at the far corner of the property until I was nearly beside him. He was in his mid-60s, with silver hair, and the kind of posture that comes from decades of being the most important person in any room. He held a small coffee cup in both hands, staring out at the vineyard with an expression of genuine peace. He looked up when I approached, and he smiled. Not the polished smile of a wealthy man performing graciousness, but something quieter and more direct. "You're an early riser," he said. "Habit," I said. "Emergency medicine runs on strange hours." Something shifted in his expression then. Not dramatically, just a small, careful adjustment, like a man who has just heard a note he recognizes. "Emergency medicine," he repeated. "Which hospital?" "St. Catherine's back home," I said. 11 years. Though I also do volunteer work overseas. I've done 3 rotations with an international medical corps in West Africa. He was quiet for a moment that was longer than comfortable. "I'm Nadine Osei," I said, extending my hand. He took it, and then he said something that made the morning go very still around me. "I know who you are," he said. "I've been trying to figure out the right moment to tell you something since you checked in yesterday. My name is Richard Ashworth Reeves. I'm Theodore's father." He paused. "And 4 years ago in Accra you saved my colleague's life." The mist on the lower vines didn't move. The birds kept their distant, quiet conversation. And I stood there on that stone path and tried to remember which life he meant, because in 11 years of emergency medicine and 3 overseas rotations, there had been more than one. His colleague's name was Dr. James Okafor, and the moment Richard said it, I remembered everything. Accra 4 years ago. A conference on infectious disease management, held at a research center on the outskirts of the city. I had been there on my 2nd overseas rotation, working 12-hour days at a regional clinic, while attending evening lectures at the conference when I could manage. I had not been a scheduled participant. I had walked in off the street, essentially because a colleague had a spare badge, and the topic was relevant to what I was seeing in the clinic. Dr. Okafor had been the afternoon keynote speaker. Brilliant man, famous in his field, a living institution in West African medical research. He had stepped off the stage after his presentation, shaken hands with the front row, and then quietly, and without drama collapsed. It was the without drama part that made it dangerous. He didn't fall loudly. He folded. The kind of collapse that looks, for a terrible moment, like someone sitting down. I was at the back of the room. I saw it before the people around him fully registered what was happening. And then I was moving. I will not say it was heroism because I don't experience it that way. In emergency medicine, crisis compresses everything: hesitation, social anxiety, the awareness of being watched. And what's left is just the work. I called out for someone to call emergency services. I assessed him in seconds. Cardiac event, irregular and fading. I did what needed to be done with what was available, which was not much, until the paramedics arrived 6 minutes later. James Okafor survived. He was treated, stabilized, and eventually made a full recovery. I stayed at the conference just long enough to know he was stable, then went back to the clinic for a night shift. I never gave anyone my contact information. I didn't attend any follow-up events. I left Accra at the end of my rotation and went back to St. Catherine's and slept for 14 hours. Richard Ashworth Reeves, it turned out, had been in that room. He was one of the conference funders, a man who had spent 30 years building a global health research foundation. He had watched a young woman with no visible panic and no need for recognition save his closest colleague's life. He had tried to find out who she was afterward. The trail had gone cold. "I've been looking for you," he said, there on the stone path with the morning mist around us. Not obsessively, but when James recovered, his first question was who the woman was. "We never found out. Not even a name." "I don't usually stay for the thank yous," I said. My voice was steady. My hands were not. "I know that now," he said. "I know considerably more about you now." He paused with the deliberateness of a man who chooses his words carefully. "When I saw your name on the guest list, I had to confirm it was really you." I made a call to a colleague at St. Catherine's yesterday morning. So he had known. He'd known since yesterday morning, when I was sitting at my outside table thinking I was invisible. He looked at me with an expression I had no good category for. Something between gratitude and apology and something else, something more complicated, that I wouldn't understand until he explained what he intended to do about it. I want to acknowledge what you did, he said. Properly. Publicly. He paused again. I think today might be an appropriate occasion. And before I could respond, before I could even locate all the complicated feelings moving through me, his phone chimed and he looked down at it and said, "That's Theo. I need to get back." He stood and took my hand again, not a handshake this time but something more deliberate. "I hope you'll allow me to speak. During the reception. It won't take long. But it needs to be said." He walked back up the stone path toward the main house. And I stood in the mist and thought about what it means when a story you thought was finished turns out to have been waiting patiently for its final chapter. I sat with what Richard had told me all through the morning, turning it over quietly while the estate erupted into the controlled chaos of wedding preparation. Hair and makeup for the bridal party were happening in the main suite. I had not been invited to join. I was not a bridesmaid, which was fine. So I dressed in my own room with the unhurried calm of someone who has learned not to need an audience. The black gown I'd brought was simple and well cut. I wore my grandmother's gold earrings and a single bangle on my left wrist. I looked, in the mirror, like someone who belonged exactly where she was. I want to say that Richard's words had made me feel vindicated or triumphant. The honest answer is more complicated than that. I felt seen, which is different from vindicated. It's quieter and more tender and somehow harder to carry. Being seen after years of being looked past is not the relief you imagine it will be. It's almost like taking off shoes you've worn so long you forgot they were too tight. And underneath the feeling of being seen was something I hadn't prepared for. The awareness that the person who had most consistently made me invisible was my stepsister. And in a few hours, Richard Ashworth Reeves was going to stand up in front of everyone she wanted to impress and correct that. I was not sure how I felt about that. I am still not entirely sure. I ran into Gloria in the hallway outside my room, making her careful way toward the ceremony location on her aching joints, beautiful in a dusty rose mother-of-the-bride-style dress, her silver hair pinned elegantly. She stopped when she saw me and her face did something soft and proud. "Nadine," she said, and then she didn't add anything, just looked at me for a long moment. "You look exactly like yourself. That's the best thing a person can look like." I hugged her gently, mindful of her joints. She smelled like the same floral perfume she'd worn since I was 9 years old. "Is she happy?" I asked. Gloria considered it honestly, the way she always considered things. "She's excited," she said finally. "Whether that's the same as happy, I suppose we'll find out." We walked to the ceremony together, her hand light on my arm. What I didn't know was that Vivienne had seen me through the window of the bridal suite as I'd crossed the courtyard with her mother on my arm. And that what she'd seen had made her feel something she wasn't prepared to name. And that she had, in that moment, made a comment to her head bridesmaid that the bridesmaid would repeat to someone else, and that someone else would repeat to me by the end of the night. But that part comes later. The ceremony was held in the vineyard itself, chairs arranged in curving rows between 2 ancient rows of vines, the afternoon light falling at the precise golden angle that made everything look lit for a film. An arch of white garden roses and trailing eucalyptus marked the altar. A string quartet played something classic and unhurried. I found a seat near the middle next to Rosaria, who had clearly also been moved from the outer edges, and who patted my knee once in greeting without looking away from her phone, where she appeared to be photographing everything for reasons she didn't explain. Theo cried when he saw Vivienne. That did something to me I hadn't anticipated. Sincere tears on an adult man's face are not easily dismissed. Whatever Vivienne's calculations, whatever her measurements of advantage and currency, this man was in love with her in a way that was completely unperformed. It was the most real thing I'd seen all weekend, and it made me want suddenly and fiercely for her to deserve it. The ceremony was 40 minutes. Vows they had written themselves, specific and unguarded and occasionally funny. A reading from Gloria that she delivered slowly and perfectly on her aching feet without a single visible wince. A blessing from Theo's grandmother, delivered in a mix of English and what I believed was Portuguese, which no one translated and which seemed to say everything necessary. When they kissed, Rosaria put 2 fingers in her mouth and whistled, and the polite vineyard applause erupted briefly into actual cheering, and for about 90 seconds, I forgot everything complicated and just felt the uncomplicated human pleasure of watching two people choose each other. Then we moved to the reception, and I felt Richard's eyes find me from across the courtyard as we filed into the reception tent, and I knew the evening was not finished being interesting. The dinner was long and beautiful, and I ate well and spoke to Rosaria about her life in New Haven and her 40-year career as a middle school art teacher, and I felt genuinely happy in her company, which was its own small grace. The toasts began after dessert. Theo's best man was funny and appropriate. Gloria spoke briefly, and with the kind of eloquence that comes not from craft, but from genuine feeling. Vivienne's college roommate told a story that made everyone laugh. Then the microphone was passed, and Richard Ashworth-Reeves stood up. He was the kind of man who commands silence by simply standing. No need for a clink of a glass, no call for attention. The tent quieted because he was standing, and because the way he stood said something important was coming. He raised his glass toward his son, and he said warm things about Theo, and about what kind of man Theo had become, and about the hope a parent carries for their child. He spoke to Vivienne with genuine welcome. He said that he was glad to know her, and that he was proud to call her family. And then he paused. And in that pause, I became aware that my heart was doing something unusual. "There is one more person I need to speak about tonight," he said. "Someone who is in this room, who I suspect would prefer that I didn't do this, and who I am going to do it anyway, with enormous respect and gratitude." He turned his eyes to me, and Vivienne, from her seat at the head table, followed his gaze. "4 years ago," Richard began, "I was in Accra, Ghana, at an international medical conference. I was there to fund a research initiative. My colleague, one of the foremost infectious disease researchers on the continent, was there to keynote. The tent was very quiet. He collapsed after his presentation. Cardiac event. In a room full of people, including several doctors, it was the chaos that you imagine. Nobody quite moving, nobody quite certain." He paused. "Except for one person." I was looking at the tablecloth. A young woman at the back of the room moved immediately, calmly, and with a competence that I have spent 4 years trying to find words for. She assessed the situation in seconds. She took charge of a room full of frightened, credentialed people without raising her voice. She directed, she acted, she kept my colleague alive until the paramedics arrived. He paused. My colleague recovered fully. He is today still working, still researching, still publishing. He has a granddaughter now. Her name is Amara. Amara. I hadn't known that. Something tightened in my chest. "For 4 years, Richard continued, I have been trying to find out who that woman was. She left no name, no contact information. She had a night shift to get back to." A quiet, warm sound moved through the tent. When I saw the guest list for this weekend, I saw a name I had been given as a possibility. A name connected to St. Catherine's Hospital, to emergency medicine, to international volunteer work. I made a call, and I confirmed what I had hoped. He raised his glass toward me. "Her name is Dr. Nadine Osei," he said. "She is a physician, an emergency medicine specialist with 11 years at St. Catherine's. She has done 3 overseas medical rotations on her own time, with her own resources, because she believes that medicine is a calling and not merely a career. She is Vivienne's stepsister, and she is one of the most extraordinary human beings I have ever had the privilege of encountering." He paused one final time. "I did not know she would be here this weekend. Life gave me the opportunity to say what I should have said 4 years ago, and I will not waste it." He turned to me directly. "Dr. Osei, thank you. For James. For every patient I'll never know about. For the work you do when no one is watching." He raised his glass. The tent rose. Not politely, not as social reflex. Actually rose, people actually standing, and the applause was the kind that comes from a room of people who have just been reminded of something they needed to be reminded of. I kept my eyes on my water glass for a moment. Then I looked up. Across the tent, at the head table, Vivienne was watching me. Her expression was one I had never seen on her face in 30 years of knowing her. It was not anger. It was not the performance of graciousness. It was something rawer than either of those things, a reckoning, perhaps, or the beginning of one. The look of a person who has held a version of events in their mind for a long time and has just watched it change shape. She was the first person to stand when the rest of the tent rose. I don't know what that cost her, but I saw her do it. The dancing started. I found a quiet spot near the edge of the tent where the canvas walls were partially open to the night air, and I stood there for a while with a glass of wine and the peculiar internal silence that descends after something significant happens. The kind of silence that isn't empty, it's full, overfull, and you need to stand still in it for a moment before you can move. Rosaria found me. Of course she did. She put her arm through mine and stood beside me looking out at the dancers, and she said, "I knew when I told you to meet Richard that this would happen." "You knew?" I said. "I suspected," she amended. "He had been looking at you since you arrived." I could see him thinking. Richard thinks loudly for a quiet man. She sipped her wine. He has been carrying that story for 4 years. It was heavy. He needed to put it down. He didn't need to put it down at a wedding, I said, but without heat. "Oh, but he did," Rosaria said simply. "Because the person who needed to hear it most was here. And she needed to hear it in public." She didn't look at me when she said it. "Your stepsister is not a bad person, Nadine. She is a person who learned early that the world would reward her for certain things, and she arranged herself accordingly. That is not evil. It is just a kind of poverty dressed up in expensive clothes." I thought about that for a long time afterward. I thought about it when Richard came to find me, perhaps 30 minutes later, and shook my hand again and said simply, "Thank you for not being angry with me." "I'm not angry," I said. And then, because it was true, "It's the nicest thing anyone has done for me in a very long time." He nodded, and his eyes were bright, and he said, "James wants your contact information. He's wanted it for 4 years. Would that be all right?" "Yes," I said. "That would be all right." I thought about it when Gloria found me on the dance floor, later in the evening, and swayed gently beside me to a slow song, her joints eased by a glass of wine and the permission the music gave her to move carefully, on her own terms. She didn't mention what had happened. She just danced. And I thought about it when Vivienne found me. She came to me around 10 o'clock, when the dancing was in full swing, and the noise level had risen to the comfortable roar of a party that has decided to be genuinely good. She was still in her dress, hair slightly loosened, cheeks flushed with either wine or emotion or both. She stood in front of me and she said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "I didn't know." "I know," I said. "I called you a nurse in the toast," she said. "I did it on purpose." She said it flatly, without excuse. I respected that. I've been doing things like that for a long time. Making you smaller. Fitting you into spaces I could manage. She paused. "I told Theo tonight just now, and do you know what he said?" I shook my head. He said, "I know." I could tell the moment she walked in that she was someone. She laughed, a small, cracked sound. "My husband figured it out before the rehearsal dinner." I didn't fill the silence. "I'm not going to make a big speech about how sorry I am," she said. "I don't think you want that, and I think I'd probably do it badly." She looked at me. Really looked, the way she hadn't since we were children, trading memories of our mothers in the dark. "But I'm asking if there's something left between us. Some version of being sisters that isn't this." She gestured vaguely at the air between us. "Whatever this has been." I thought about the 9-year-old who had wanted it to be different. And I thought about the woman standing in front of me, on her wedding night, choosing honesty over performance for perhaps the first time in 30 years. "There might be," I said. "Let's find out." She nodded. And then she did something she hadn't done since we were children. She reached out and briefly, quickly squeezed my hand. Then she turned and walked back to her husband on the dance floor. I watched her go. And I felt, for the first time all weekend, that I had come to the right place. I flew back on a Sunday afternoon in a window seat, with the low gold light of early autumn cutting across the wing. I thought about what you carry back from a weekend like that, and whether it's heavier or lighter than what you arrived with. I'm still not entirely certain. Some of what I brought home was heavier. The rawness of being publicly seen, the complicated hope of a relationship that might be repaired, the grief of the years that had passed in the arrangement we'd settled for. You can't get those years back. That's the weight. But some of what I carried home was genuinely lighter. The message from Dr. James Okafor came while I was in the air. A long and careful message from a man who had clearly thought for some time about how to write it. He told me about his recovery. He told me about his granddaughter Amara, who was 3 years old and already, he said, absolutely impossible and entirely magnificent. He thanked me in the language of someone who understands the texture of saving and being saved, not with hyperbole but with the specificity of a person who knows what they are talking about. He asked if I would consider, at some future point, consulting on a research project his team was developing around emergency care capacity in regional African hospitals. Just a conversation, no commitment, but he thought my field experience would be valuable. I read it twice, there at 30,000 feet, and then I looked out the window at the enormous, indifferent sky. Here is the thing about working in emergency medicine that most people on the outside don't understand. You rarely see the endings. People arrive in crisis and you act, and then they are taken somewhere else or they go home or they don't make it. And the work continues, the next case arrives, the shift moves forward. You learn not to need closure because the work doesn't offer it. You learn that the doing is the thing, not the knowing what becomes of it. What this weekend handed me was an ending. An improbable, accidental, vineyard-wrapped ending to a chapter one had considered permanently unresolved. James Okafor was alive. He had a granddaughter named Amara. He had been trying to find me. The work had mattered in the specific, personal, named way that work so rarely gets to matter. I thought about Vivienne and her hand, quick and careful, squeezing mine. I thought about Gloria swaying to a slow song on aching joints, giving me the gift of her presence without the weight of words. I thought about Richard Ashworth Reeves standing up at his son's wedding and choosing to do the right thing not because it was easy, but because it had been waiting to be done. And I thought about this, the moments that define us are not usually the ones we plan. They are not the toasts we prepare, or the gowns we carefully select, or the smiles we practice in mirrors before difficult occasions. They are the moments we move towards something because it is necessary, without waiting for permission or recognition or the right conditions. They are the moments we act from who we are rather than from how we hope to appear. I had spent a weekend being called a nurse by someone who wanted me to be manageable, and I had come home with a message from a man who was alive because I had known what to do and done it. I had come home with the possibility of a sister, rebuilt from something that had nearly become nothing. I had come home with James Okafor's granddaughter's name, Amara, which means grace in several languages, and which felt, sitting in that window seat in the gold afternoon light, like exactly the right word. The plane began its descent. Somewhere below me was St. Catherine's Hospital, and the night shift I'd pick up on Tuesday, and the next patient who would arrive in crisis and need someone who moved without hesitation. I pressed my forehead briefly against the cool glass of the window. And I thought, I am ready.